We're about to leave. It's just after 8:10 and heading off to Sydney.
Trace James Joseph Wilson and Michael Henry Jones.
Yes, yep. Alright, here we are. Maiden voyage. What have you got to say, Dad?
We're all set to go. Our big adventure. So started a trip that would cover more than 1900 miles or 3,000 kilometres over 7 days. It all began when my son Roger offered to take me on a trip, it was a Christmas present, to visit the places our colonial ancestors in the Wilson and Jones line lived and worked in. We're talking about an area that runs up through northwestern New South Wales to Coonamble, which is 330 miles or 532 kilometres from Sydney. He could not have offered me a better present because I had spent hours over the last 15 years building the family tree. My research appeared in my book, Prison Halt to Redemption. However, I had never seen most of the places that appeared in the book, so eagerly set down to plan a route. We would start off in Melbourne, where we live, but from Sydney the trip would take us over the Blue Mountains or the Great Dividing Range to Bathurst. Then following the Castlereagh Highway, we would go to Rylstone, Mudgee, Golgong, Tallawang, and via Dunedoo, Mandurin, Gilgandra, Galagabone to Coonamble. From Coonamble we'd go back down the Castlereagh Highway and take the Golden Highway through to Muswellbrook and Singleton, and then on to Sydney. Muswellbrook and Singleton were where my great-great-grandfather Michael Jones lived and owned property. Because of our time limits and because we were coming up from Melbourne, I decided we would save time by heading first over the Blue Mountains and follow the route to Coonamble, and then coming back to Sydney, do our presentations at Botany Bay and Sydney Cove. Some editing would rearrange the route into the chronological order of my ancestors' lives. Roger bought an excellent camera and I wrote a script for presentations in the important places. The viewer will have to allow me to read the presentations because there was not enough time to memorise them, and I did not trust my ability to speak off the cuff. So we set off from Melbourne on our epic journey on 14 October 2022. As Roger and I had no experience in such ambitious filmmaking, we were flying by the seat of our pants. But despite a whole lot of bumbling, stumbling and stuttering from me, we visited all the places on our itinerary and more, and we had a thoroughly enjoyable time. Now join Roger and me as we set off from Melbourne on a father and son trip punctuated by many coffee and snack stops. Our first stop was in Euroa, where there were signs of the extensive floods in New South Wales and Victoria in the previous months. Fortunately, we did not encounter the floods or their aftermath at any time.
Stopped in Euroa. First stop of the road trip.
Yeah.
And we've got a bit of flooding here.
Coffee stop.
We've got coffee and treats for morning tea. What snack have we got?
You've got sandwiches, you've got pastrami and smoked salmon sandwiches.
Wow.
And some biscuits if you want.
Luxury.
Yeah.
Sorry, was that, where are we?
Gundagai, dog on the tacker box.
Gundagai. We're actually by the side of the road.
Yeah. Dog on the tacker box is going there.
Here we are. The dog on the tucker box. Oops. Give us a wave. Here we are at the Gundagai charging stop. It's looking pretty busy.
Pillows.
What have you got?
I'm going to come back for my pillows.
Alright, here we are at Auntie Narelle and Uncle Emil's place. Here we go. Beautiful Saturday morning. It's about 10 past 8. A bit later than we wanted to get out. We're trying to get out at 8. Alright, you're all packed up and ready?
We're ready to go.
Yeah.
First
We're
stop.
a bit behind schedule, 25 past 8.
Yep. So the first stop will be Bringelly over near Penrith.
Bringelly, alright.
Before we go to Bringelly, we must go to a place where in April 1770 an event dramatically changed the history of the world. On the 29th of April 1770, Captain Cook steered his ship, the Endeavour, through the mouth of an expansive bay. The mouth of that bay is just behind me, over here. He proceeded further down the bay and went ashore at a spot around 200 yards from where I'm standing. Captain Cook came ashore with some of his men, particularly with Joseph Banks, the botanist, and they explored the bay, taking samples of wood, plants and animals. They had a couple of contacts with the Aboriginals and they weren't so friendly. So after 8 days they set sail and proceeded up north. Entrance to Botany Bay, a close-up entrance. First fleet came in. La Perouse is opposite. Captain Cook embarked about 300 yards further along. We moved further down Botany Bay and to the point where Captain Cook came ashore. There's that rock there beyond the sculpture. At first Cook named the bay Stingray Bay because of the many stingrays in its waters, but he later renamed it Botany Bay in tribute to Joseph Banks and his collection of specimens. The short stay did not give Cook time to do more, but short as it was of momentous importance for world history. We'll go across the bay to discover what happened 18 years later. On the 18th of January 1788, the armed frigate HMS Supply entered Botany Bay, you see here, over my shoulder. On board was Captain Arthur Phillip. He was leading the first fleet, the 11 ships charged with founding a British settlement on a continent with no fixed name and sparsely populated by nomadic tribes. The ships of the first fleet were the 2 naval ships, the armed brig HMS Supply and the warship HMS Sirius. The 6 convict ships were the Alexander, the Charlotte, the Friendship, the Lady Penrhyn, the Prince of Wales and the Scarborough. And the 3 food and supply transport were the Golden Grove, Fishburn and Borrowdale. By the 20th of January, the 11 ships were assembled in Botany Bay. That fleet of tiny ships by today's measure had arrived without loss after sailing 15,000 miles during 252 days with never a navigational falter. It was an incredible feat that people have compared to the expedition to the moon. Now the ships came 1.5 miles into the bay and moored probably over there. The crews went ashore to cut grass for the animals who were starving on board, but apart from that, nobody except a reconnoitring group went ashore. Now, incredible as it may seem, I have two ancestors on the First Fleet. Frederick Meredith, the steward to the master of the Scarborough, and convict Eleanor Fraser on the Prince of Wales, though it is probable that Eleanor was transferred later to the Charlotte. Governor Phillip did not find the conditions at Botany Bay as James Cook and botanist Joseph Banks had described. There was nowhere suitable to set up an encampment for more than 1,000 people. Watkin Tench, captain of the Marines, wrote that the country around Botany Bay was, quote, rather disappointing for our hopes, being invariably sandy and unpromising for the purposes of cultivation, though the trees and the grass flourish in great luxuriancy, unquote. More importantly, they could not find a sufficient supply of fresh water. On the 21st of January, Governor Phillip decided to take a party to Port Jackson to see if there was a more suitable place for the settlement. David Collins, captain of the Marines, wrote that in one of the coves of this noble and capacious harbour, equal if not superior to any yet known in the world, it was determined to fix the settlement. Once Phillip had decided on a place for the settlement, he lost no time in ordering the fleet to Sydney Cove, named in compliment to Lord Sydney, the Principal Secretary of State for the Home Department. He sailed to Sydney Cove in the Sirius on the evening of the 25th. On the morning of the 26th of January, he rowed ashore with his party. Philip Gidley King, second lieutenant on the Sirius and later Governor King, wrote of the occasion. At daylight, the English colours were displayed on shore and possession was taken for His Majesty, whose health, with the Queen's, Prince of Wales, and success to the colony, was drunk. A feu de joie, a volley, was fired by the party of Marines, and the whole gave 3 cheers, which was returned by the supply at anchor in Sydney Cove. In planting the British flag and raising a toast, Governor Phillip also planted the seed of a new nation. We'll proceed now to Sydney Cove. It's a full view of Botany Bay, mostly unchanged since the time of the First Fleet, except for the onshore buildings and so on, but the outline of the bay is, and certainly the heads, is unchanged. Across the bay, where we're looking now, is Colonel. That's where Captain Cook landed.
Is that a wrap, Dad?
That's a wrap.
Got that. Come out in the blooper reel.
Oh, sorry. I'm on the Manly Ferry. The Manly Ferry runs from the beach suburb of Manly on the northern side of Sydney Harbour to Circular Quay or Sydney Cove on the southern side. It's a commuter service for city workers. It's also extremely popular among tourists. It suits my purposes because for most of the trip it traces the route of the First Fleet from Sydney Heads to Sydney Cove. I have reduced the 30-minute trip to 4 minutes. As we look at the tremendous development along the shores, we can try to imagine the settlers' awe as they stared at the pristine inlets, coves, trees and bush. There was nothing else besides the barely visible, sparse nomadic tribes who inhabited the area. I looked through the eyes of my ancestors, Frederick Meredith and Eleanor Fraser. This glorious site is 234 years after the landing, 234 years of explosive development. This illustration is 3 months after the landing, showing the north-south stream, named the Tank Stream, the marine and convict camps on the west side, and the King's Wharf and the government buildings on the east side. Back to the present. King's Wharf was towards the corner on the left. And the stream, the Tank Stream, was in the corner on the right. The remainder of the fleet assembled in the cove on the 26th. The ships were tied to the trees on both sides of the cove, here and over that direction. The next day, a part of the Marines landed, and the day after that, the rest of the fleet was brought ashore. One important reason for the Governor Phillip's choice of Sydney Cove for the settlement was a stream that ran north-south into the cove over in that corner over there. Ships in the way. On both sides of this stream, the town of Sydney developed. No time was lost in putting the fleet's people to work to establish the settlement. 39 years later, on the 27th of September 1827, the Prince Regent arrived at Sydney Cove and moored near King's Wharf over there, as I pointed out before, on the left-hand side of the ferry terminals. The Prince Regent brought 180 convicts, among whom was 18-year-old James Joseph Wilson. James Joseph was lucky to be marching along George Street between a bustling crowd of Sydney-siders and not laying in the moist London earth after being strung up for burglary. It wasn't his first conviction. There were at least 2 other cases the same year. His death sentence was commuted to transportation for life. Cheeky James Joseph was a qualified brass founder or brass polisher, but evidently thought there was more in breaking into people's houses than the boring work of brass polisher, a trade which often left men with lung disease. As with most convicts, James Joseph was assigned to a landholder to work on his property. Convict labour was then an indispensable part of the development of the colony. He was assigned to Robert Lowe, who began with a grant of land at Bringelly at the foot of the Great Dividing Range and about 15 miles south of today's Penrith. He later acquired land in the Sidmouth Valley near Bathurst, and later still in Mudgee. James Joseph's convict indents on arrival states that he was disposed of to Robert Lowe, Bringelly. A little over a year later, on the 24th or the 28th of December 1828, I'm not too sure about the arrival date, the Royal George arrived with a cargo of 158 convicts. 17-year-old Michael Henry Jones was amongst the prisoners. On the 22nd of October 1827, 16-year-old Michael had been convicted of street robbery in the Salford courts of Manchester and sentenced to 7 years to the colony in New South Wales. Michael was part of a gang that had robbed a poor silk weaver of his fortnightly wages. It was a particularly cruel and violent crime, but Michael was not without experience of violence. His convict indent describes a slight, fair boy of just 5 foot 1 inch, 154 centimetres, with marks of violence on his face and a burn mark on his arm. His trade or calling was stated as factory boy. In other words, he worked on one of the notorious factories of Manchester, where employees were often under conditions of slave labour. Michael's experience of violence was not at an end. He was transferred to the prison hulk Captivity, moored at Portsmouth. A prison hulk was a decommissioned ship moored close inshore on the coast or rivers to house convicts that the jails could not accommodate. Conditions in the prison hulks were harsh. Violence was meted out by guards and prisoners alike. Michael spent 9 months on the captivity before being dumped on the Royal George for the 120-day trip to Sydney. On arrival, Michael was assigned to landholder William Bowman, whose farm at Richmond was at Richmond. Like Bringelly, Richmond was west of Sydney at the foot of the Blue Mountains and around 10 miles north of present-day Penrith. William Bowman was the son of John Bowman. Both father and son were pastoralists. William took over the farm from 1825 to 1832. He accompanied William Rylstone on one of his early explorative treks to the north, which resulted in his taking up land at Mullamuddy, which was south of Mudgee. In 1825 he received grants of land on the Trafalgar River, which rises near Cassillis and flows towards Dubbo in northwestern New South Wales. Bowman had farming properties at Bathurst, Cassillis, Mullamuddy and Cudgegon. We must proceed to Bogey in the Rylstone district to know what happened to Michael Henry Jones. The north-south stream that ran into Sydney Cove, which gave very good reason for the settlement here, actually still runs, but it runs under the wharf over here. It can actually be visited, but you have to walk downstairs to get to it. It's all been built over now, but the stream still exists. We have a last look at Sydney Cove, comparing its present magnificence with Sydney Cove as depicted shortly after settlement in this illustration. On the right is the tank stream. On the left is where King's Wharf would have been. Between the two tall buildings is the heritage-listed Sydney Customs House. Nearby is a plaque on a tiled bench that marks where Captain Arthur Phillip drove the British flag into the soil of Sydney Cove, thereby originating a new nation. Robert Lowe's farm, of course, is no longer there, but Bringelly as a vicinity is, and this is where we are. This is the sort of countryside to the west of Sydney where the great landholders settled and ran their farms. There is actually a creek here that's called Lowe's Creek in memory of Robert Lowe, who not only had property here in Bringelly but also over near Bathurst. You can see from the countryside the sort of area that James Joseph Wilson worked in when he first came to Australia in 1827, and also Michael Jones. He was settled in the Bowman property up past Penrith in the Windsor and Richmond area. So the land would not have changed much. It's still very rural. Now this is Lowe's Creek, which indicates that we're in the area, the vicinity of where Robert Lowe had his farm, to which James Joseph Wilson was assigned when he arrived in Sydney Cove in 1827. This countryside here is the same all the way through to Windsor and Richmond, and then Windsor and Richmond was where Michael Jones was assigned to the Bowman property. That's the end of our first episode. Join us on our second episode while we make a stop at Hartley Village and have a cup of coffee, of course, and then head on to the Rylstone area where Roger has some fun with our accommodation.